Well, hey, everyone. Welcome back to The Current. This is Real Talk on Real Topics. We are in part 4 of our podcast series going through the Apostles' Creed. Curtis, what's next?
So we've already covered a lot of ground. We just talked about fun things like the Holy Spirit, the virgin birth. Now we're taking a bit of a turn. We're going to talk more about the Jesus story. Today, the portion of the Apostles' Creed we're going to cover is that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified, died, and was buried. Should be great.
That should be really good. Should be really good. Well, let's just go in order here. Let's kind of work our way through it. We'll make some points about this portion of the creed. First, it mentions that Jesus suffered, which I think is awesome. It mentions this because I think, and we'll talk about this for, I think, a little bit here, but I think one of the most assuring things for me in my faith is we serve a God that knows what suffering is like.
Yeah.
You know?
That's really good.
I love that. I love that, like, it's not, he's not this being that's just floating in the sky and doesn't understand suffering. Because we all suffer.
Yeah.
You know? I just love that. So, I don't know, God's so relatable.
That's so good. Immediately you say that, my mind jumps right to Hebrews, where it talks about that, he's not unsympathetic to our weaknesses. He knows. There is something to say like, hey, God knows what it's like to be human, which is incredible. But more than that, God knows what it's like to suffer. He's experienced pain. That's such a good point. He's not far off and distant, unable to relate to us in our struggles. But I think another thing I love about the word suffered in this portion of the creed is I think it kind of protects us from particular readings that are a bit more, maybe I want to say like prosperity gospel or some more sort of triumphalistic readings of Christianity. I've ran into people who will say like, hey, if you say yes to Jesus, then like your life's going to be great. Everything will be good. You're going to have money. You're going to have this. You'll have health, all that sort of stuff. But the creed even captures for us right here is that even Jesus himself wasn't spared suffering in life. And Jesus tells us that even a slave's no greater than its master. We should be able to expect the same sort of thing. So I think there's some balance here that we get offered that says suffering is in some ways a part of the Christian life. Jesus promises his disciples that they're going to experience it. But at the same time, it holds out hope and says, but take heart, I've overcome the world. There's hope to be found there. But the Christian message is that almost hope in life is experienced through suffering, not through just avoiding it.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said. I mean, there's different parts of different faiths where, like, you think about monks or what's another I'm looking for, like this idea of like getting at like we're just like suffering.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Like I don't know if it's monks. I don't know if that's the right term.
I think so.
But there's just this idea of like this is the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
This idea of suffering.
And that's there's some balance there to be struck, like we talked about.
Sure.
I love this idea that on the one hand, Christianity offers us a real, genuine hope that there is suffering, and it gives us the ability to say, this isn't how the world should be. But what we find is, Jesus doesn't just overcome wickedness through, just kicking it, and saying goodbye, I'll see you later, and dealing with it. But rather, we find the way to overcome, the way to resurrection comes through the way of the cross, through suffering, through death. And so there's a sense in which even Paul invites us into this. He says, to the extent that we share in Christ's death, we'll share in a resurrection like his. And so I think the Christian message here says not, hey, accept Jesus and everything's going to be fine, but rather accept Jesus and your suffering is not pointless. There can be purpose to it. We can find a way through it and out the other side.
Yeah. And as we read, in the scriptures, it says so many times, whenever you face trials, consider it joy.
Oh, yeah.
Because the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And there's, like we always say, God doesn't cause the pain and suffering, but he can always use it and for our good, which is, again, like I love just this whole idea on suffering that Jesus suffered. It's just also comforting. And I think I'll just mention this real quick because obviously in our line of work, we walk alongside people who are suffering often. It's part of kind of what we do. People that are suffering, we walk alongside them. Yeah. But there's so much comfort to be found in this idea or this portion of the creed saying that, like, hey, you might feel like God is not here right now. Like he's not close to the situation or he doesn't care. But, you know, we serve a God that suffered. He knows exactly what it feels like. He knows exactly what you're going through. You talk about abandonment or, you know, just like all the feelings that we feel sometimes. I think Jesus also has experienced those and he can relate. He understands. And I just think there's so much power in that just practically for people. And so if you're listening, I'm saying if you're suffering or in the middle of suffering or you can probably expect it to happen someday, if not now, just know that God is in the middle of it and he still works in the midst of it. And suffering is the way of Jesus. And, you know, I think when, not that it's any easier, I'll say, you know, I'm not like just saying, oh, it's like everything's fine because of Jesus. Like obviously it's hard and the things people go through breaks my heart, but Jesus sees that and he can relate. And I think it's in those moments. So whenever you pray or you cry out to God, knowing that he, I think, understands is just so powerful. And it's not what he wants, but he is there. He's present in it.
That's so good. So. And I love that to think about Jesus suffering and to think about, you know, that sort of story. For me, it also kind of validates this portion of the human experience. Like, some people you'll come up to and it's like, well, hey, you're suffering, like what's going on? Like you must have sinned or, you know, that sort of a concept. But Jesus sort of challenges this notion and says, no, sometimes suffering doesn't come because you've done something wrong, but suffering is the consequence of what it looks like to live a faithful life to God in a fallen world. That Jesus starts going along a path of obedience. I want to say, hey, this is what God calls me to live like. And that kind of puts him against some of the ways of the world and ends up kind of causing him to find himself crucified, you know. It kind of pushes back against it. But I think the suffering validates and says, hey, this is part of the human life. I can look to the Psalms and listen to David talk about the suffering and the angst. So I want to tell people, like, you're not, if you're in a season of suffering, like, you're not broke as a Christian, like, you're not doing something wrong, you know. There is room for those kind of experiences to genuinely happen in the Christian life. And so I love that, Christianity is not a religion of rose-colored glasses that's just like, oh, everything will be fine, don't worry about it. It's very realistic in its assessment of like what the world's going to look like, but it embraces it, you know, not naively, understanding what's there, but also offering a very real hope. And so I love that. There seems to be more substance there. Yeah, exactly. And of course we know the story, and you know, as much as there's suffering, there is, like you just said, hope on the other side of it, that really, no matter what we go through, it's not the final say. And we'll get there maybe next week. True. Yeah, we'll talk about why we have so much hope. So that's really good. Talked about suffering. I think that's just a key word in the creed. But then it goes on to say, under Pontius Pilate. So why would you say the writers of this creed, when it was kind of founded, why would they include that specific detail? That's a really great question, because up to this point, we've gotten a lot of kind of doctrine. We believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. We believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son. We're getting a lot of ideas. And so there can be a temptation to limit Christianity to just kind of a set of beliefs and ideas. It's very theological. We're all brainwashed, bro. Exactly. It's just about thinking things, you know, intellectual assent. But once we get to this part in the creed, Pontius Pilate busts onto the scene, and then suddenly our story is grounded and rooted to history. And I love this. When we're talking about Christianity, if we're just talking about ideas, we've stopped short. Really what the creed wants to give us is a story, is an event, a person who came, walked this earth, suffered under Pontius Pilate, a figure of history. That's right. They're wanting to root and ground, this faith in events that have transpired here. And so I love that because it reminds us, again, as Christians, our focus isn't just around some set of beliefs we need to affirm, but rather we're focusing around a person, an event, this Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, died, buried, and raised from the dead.
That's right. Yeah, and I love that you said it's not centered around a group of beliefs, and even to take it a step further, it's really not even centered around a group of scriptures or writings. It is centered on an actual event, an actual person who actually lived. And, I've shared this before, but I love telling people why I'm a Christian is because I literally believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Yes. I believe that actually happened on this planet. Like, that is why. And really no other reason, And again, we've talked about this so many times, but, like, there's so many smart people out there, people much smarter than me, that if your faith is really rooted and centered on anything other than that, they can make you feel about this big.
Sure,
There's a lot of smart people that can, like, totally dissect, a faith founded on just the scriptures or a faith founded just on belief.
Yes.
And they can pick you apart saying, like, but, like, denying the resurrection is something completely different.
Yeah.
I feel like you have to jump through a lot more hoops and kind of have to work a little bit harder to get away from that historical, actual person thing that's documented in history,
That's such a good point, too. Like, I think sometimes when it comes to dialogues between, Christians and non-Christians or maybe some more atheist or non-believer types, sometimes we kind of play the game on their terms in the sense of, like, they'll bring and say, here's all the issues with the Bible. And we feel the need to say, let me just have a ready particular answer for every single potential thing that could come up in this book. And really, I don't think, as much as we want to confess alongside Christianity that the Bible's important, that it's inspired, it's profitable for certain things, if we're saying this is what we need to defend and this is what we need to be able to stand on, I think we're already off on the wrong foot. Where instead to say, no, for Paul, it's not, is every single mark of the Bible totally true and can I know it and that's exactly it? No, for him, he says, was Christ raised from the dead or not? And if he wasn't, then let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die. Who cares what's going on here? For Paul, it says, did this person rise from the dead bodily or didn't he? And at the end of the day, that should be where our dialogue is and where it hinges. There's other important things too, but sometimes we just get bogged down in the wrong stuff. And I think it's important to note when the Creed is talking about this, it's talking about Jesus being raised from the dead. We need to affirm this. But notice it doesn't make any claims about what we need to think about Jonah. Was Jonah really in the belly of a whale for 3 days and that? And how long did it take to walk across Tarshish? Is this actually possible? And I think we're just getting bogged down in stuff we don't need to.
That's right.
At the end of the day, if it really happened, sure, I think God's capable of doing those things. At the end of the day, if it didn't happen historically, but this is still a text that's attempting to give us some theological information and is really telling us true and valid things, even if it's not historically grounded, isn't important. I don't really care, I guess, is the short way. But I do care if that tomb was empty come Easter morning.
Yeah, that's right. Centered on an event. And I would just say, too, the little plug here, if you're interested in more of, like, kind of an in-depth study of this idea of our faith being, like, centered on a historic event. So, again, in this creed, suffered under Pontius Pilate. It's real time in history.
Yeah.
I would recommend the book Irresistible by Andy Stanley if you're interested in that, because it kind of gets at this idea of, like, an irresistible faith. What does that look like? But he really does a good job of walking through kind of the Old Testament to New Testament and really just, like, hammering home this idea of, like, our faith being centered on Jesus and this death, burial, resurrection piece, like a point in history. Our faith is centered on an event in time, like that we can point to in history. So anyway, I would just kind of plug that, throw that
That's
out there.
Good.
It's a really good one.
Really great book. Something that I think is really practical and easy to read too. It's really great. A solid book. One more thing before we jump on to the next part is the last thing that I want to mention in talking about sort of the historical groundedness of Christianity and kind of bringing in Pontius Pilate and these other historical figures makes me think one of the things I find unique about Christianity is that it is, I want to use this word carefully. I don't think we have some knockdown, drag out argument that is, here's the silver bullet, but I think it is to a degree more historically verifiable. So what I want to mean by that is, a lot of the other major world religions are kind of founded on private religious experience, right? You have, the Buddha reaching enlightenment under the Bodhidharma tree after he runs off from the tower and has that moment. You have Muhammad, who gets the revelation from God to himself and writes the Quran. You have these more private religious experiences and instances of revelation where Christianity kind of centers around a publicly verifiable event.
Yeah.
It's not saying, hey, I went and I had this private religious experience with God. Now, there's instances of those in the Bible, for sure. That's something that can happen. But the event we're talking about is something that is beyond that. It's something that happened to a community. People are talking about it. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, says, hey, you still know some of these people who are around walking during this. Go talk to them, chat with them. He encourages them to seek out the sort of the witness, the testimony of there. And so I love that Christianity does have a bit more, public domain to it. There's something that we can dig a little bit more. It's not limited to sort of that private religious experience.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, just kind of as an encouragement, I feel like, obviously for the last thousands of years, the church has really swayed from, it's become something completely different than I feel like it was when they first, right after the resurrection. The faith looks so much different than what it does today. And so, but I do feel like there is a swing. There's some churches that are really looking like, how do we get back to those days? And we talk about this all the time on the podcast. Is a lot of what we're trying to do is get back to that type of faith where, again, Paul, he is sharing the gospel. He's talking about the resurrection. He's talking about the hope we have in Jesus because of an event, and so I just feel like, if you feel like you're discouraged with the church at all, or what it has become, don't give up on us yet. I think we have maybe strayed a little, but I think God in his grace is, raising people up for a more genuine, kind of authentic and real faith centered on an event in history, not a bunch of the other fluff that it has become in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
so.
I love, just kind of the heart behind our church is to, let's keep Jesus at the center. Let's have that be the focus, and let's also ask ourselves, what was it that Christians had believed in the earliest moments? Now, that doesn't mean we sign off on everything, but this is a good kind of a litmus test to say, what if we're looking so far different from what things looked like in the first few centuries, we might have some reasons to check ourselves. And so I love that, we're a church that wants to hold some things together and say, hey, we want to hear from Scripture, tradition, reason, experience, and we want to allow all these things to have a voice at the table, which is one of the great reasons why we're studying the Creed. Hey, what is it that this early Christian community confessed to be true? Yeah,
if Jesus Christ rose from the dead a couple months ago, what would our faith look like?
Yes. That's a good thought.
I don't know. Anyway, so the last part.
Yes. So suffered under Pontius Pilate, and now we get that Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. Now we're kind of getting to maybe the meat and potatoes, or what a lot of people would think of being the meat and potatoes when we come to kind of the Christian message. Okay, when you talk about, hey, what's Christianity about? Well, Jesus died for my sins is usually the answer you get. And so, now we're getting to that sort of death of Jesus. So I think the main thing I really want to note here, and this kind of piggybacks off of a episode we've had previously talking about atonement. We're getting to this idea of how is God bringing us at one together with him again. There's been division in the relationship. How are we making that at one again? And what I notice is that the Creed doesn't really spell this all out for us. It kind of leaves some broad room. It says, no, it wants to affirm that this Jesus did died, and as we're going to find out, was raised, but it doesn't really give us any more than that. And I love this because the church has kind of had different ways of thinking about and different ways of understanding how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus saves us. And so the Creed doesn't pigeonhole us into having to embrace one of those things. Yep. It gives some freedom and some flexibility for us to say, okay, what we're agreeing to is that this Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. But we don't have to necessarily sign on to a particular theory or certain mechanics of how that works out. And I think that's important.
Absolutely. And I know even in my faith journey, my atonement theory has changed.
Yeah.
Just kind of how I was raised to where I've landed now. And I agree with you. How I was raised, I think those people are Christians. I think they, we disagree now on actually what happened on the cross.
Yep.
Speaking of Jesus' death, but there's room, and I love that too, that the creed allows the space for disagreement there. I think, again, it's not, I'm glad it's in there, because obviously the death and the burial of Jesus is a huge piece of what we believe. But really what made Jesus special was what happened after that, because other people died in the same manner.
For sure.
And so anyway, we'll get to that, I'm sure, at some point. But I really feel like this understanding of just Christ's death and his burial is a huge piece of what we're talking about. But it's not necessarily what makes Jesus God, in my opinion. But it's important. And I think, because again, you have to answer the question, well, who killed Jesus?
That's another great question,
I think we did, people,
right.
Humanity. And that just shows the depth of our sin. But again, this is where you get into some of the arguments about, how I was raised. Well, God killed Jesus. God wanted it to happen. And God, and so anyway, you get into this more theological.
You start pulling that thread a little bit.
Ideas. Yep. Yeah. But I agree. I love that about the creed in general, just that so much room at the table. Different thoughts and opinions.
Yeah, and I think we keep circling back around to this, but I think it's worth it throughout this series, kind of talking about how this creed isn't, sometimes when we talk about, what we should believe as Christians, we're talking about, the Apostles' Creed and orthodoxy. It can feel like it's very dogmatic and rigid. Believe this or you can't belong. But again, the creed gives a surprising amount of room. At the end of the day, Christianity has to affirm some certain things. It has to mean something. Yeah. If Christianity means everything, then it means nothing. There has to be kind of a unified body of belief. But within that, there is so much freedom and so much room. The writers of the creed give us the what, but they don't give us the why. And there's some room for us, along with some great thinkers throughout church history, to say, okay, just exactly what is it about the death and resurrection of Jesus that is salvific? And, I'm not necessarily going to, on this podcast, give you the answers. The creed doesn't give us the answers, but giving us room to think together as a community and to think with the other, Christian thinkers of the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, obviously for me, the death and burial are, important because there's no resurrection without it.
Yeah.
He has to die in order to be, brought back to life. Yeah. But, and I get that. But I think it's kind of a side note here. I think Christianity can almost become too focused on this little portion, the death and burial.
Yeah.
And it's weird that the cross has become the symbol of Christianity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thoughts I have about this that are probably for another podcast. But
well, I'll give you just one last thing then. You say that, and immediately my mind jumped to there's a guy named Dallas Willard.
Yeah.
Fantastic Christian thinker, too.
Awesome.
He has a phrase he coined, and he talks about vampire Christians. And I love that. He says that these are Christians that are just interested in Jesus for his blood. That's the only thing they really need him for.
That's good.
They have no interest in, what was his life? What was his teaching? What about discipleship? What is he bringing? And that's a good point, too. As Christians, sometimes we can say, hey, the only thing I really needed Jesus for was for him to die. I'm glad he came and that he was God and that he died for my sins. And in some of that thinking, then, does it matter if Jesus died as a baby or as an adult? We just needed a perfect sinless sacrifice. So, more things for us to be thinking there. Maybe you're right for another podcast. But again, giving us the room here to be able to work and wrestle and think about those things.
Yeah. And as always, I think if you have, questions, concerns, kind of you want to further the discussion or you want to challenge us maybe on some of our thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. And we really do mean that. And, reach out to us. You can, maybe go to our church website, rhythmchurch.org, and you can find our contact info there. Shoot us an email or, leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube or, reach out somehow. We'd love to continue the conversation, and it's always open to dialogue. And, we never sit here and act like we've got it all figured out. We have some opinions on things, but we'd love to hear what you think. So feel free to reach out and let us know.
Yeah. It's been fun moving through this creed. get to look forward to next week. Like you said, we're going to do a couple interesting things. Descended into hell. Ooh. And then on the third day, rose again from the dead. Yeah. So lots of good stuff to look forward to next week.
Yeah. Sounds good. All right. We'll see you next week right here on The Current.